Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabert. We are MAGI. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry. Some Problems of English Masonic History, which was an inaugural paper by A.G. Markham, published in AQC, volume 110 for the year 1997. Some Problems of English Masonic History by A.G. Markham on the 14th of November 1996. This paper consists of comment on some of the problems arising in the history of English craft Freemasonry in the period ending with the union of the Grand Lodges in 1813. The notes and appendices to the printed version of the paper explain generalisations and include important further points which time does not allow to be included in this present spoken narrative. I continue next with a brief survey of familiar ground as preparation for what is said later. In the 1600s, Freemasonry was restricted to the British Isles and was a private matter, rarely recorded in writing, least of all in Ireland and less well so in England than in Scotland. This is a major problem, and it is surprising that we know as much as we do about English Masonry of the 1600s. It is possible to see the existence of a remarkable brotherhood of non-operative Masons based on well-recognised custom, including, notably, secret modes of recognition and those curious archaic documents of the old charges, spread more or less over the entire nation, crossing class boundaries in a very class-conscious age, harmoniously uniting men, including, I would accept, those of differing political persuasions, and practising mutual charity, but this evidence is limited in detail and does not extend to dispelling the mystery of its origins, a mystery which, though since to some extent cherished by Masons, has also lent itself to misinterpretation by writers both Masonic and anti-Masonic. In Scotland, written records of the 1600s show the existence of a considerable number of lodges of operative Masons, with a proportion of non-operative brethren, some of them being of high social rank, but without sufficient involvement to take control, so that the lodges remained operative in overall character as late as the 1720s. A wider organisation of these lodges is suggested through the provisions of the Shaw Statutes of 1598 and 1599. Scottish Masons had rudimentary ceremonies of admission when the secret Mason word was imparted, and versions of the old charges deriving from English originals. It is certain that Freemasonry existed in Ireland during at least part of the 1600s, but little more is known of it beyond a few questionable artefacts bearing Masonic symbols. Despite some improvement in the 1700s, lack of evidence due to confidentiality is a continuing problem. But there is no doubt that in the 1720s a dramatic upsurge of English Freemasonry took place following the formation of a Grand Lodge by 4 non-operative London lodges in 1717. This Grand Lodge flourished and greatly extended the number of lodges under its authority from 1721 onward, when the practice started of having members of the peerage as Grand Masters, though mainly as figureheads. 2 areas of Masonic ideas can be associated with this upsurge, the first being moral rules known as the Charges of a Free Mason, contained in a book of constitutions compiled at the request of Grand Lodge by James Anderson, which was published openly in 1723, and the second being found principally in an exposure of confidential matters in catechism form known as Masonry Dissected, published by Samuel Pritchard in 1730, which is concerned with secret modes of recognition and related ritual rather than moral provisions. In the 1720s and 30s, these two streams of ideas passed from England into British territories overseas, particularly the American colonies, and into Europe through France, where, for example, the exposure written by Abbé Gabriel Louis Peroux, known as Les Secrets des Francs-Maçons, published in 1742, describes the ideas as practised with little variation in France at that time, and demonstrates better than anything written in English why Freemasonry was received with such great acclaim. But the French were not content with limiting the movement to the supposed moral customs, secrets and rituals of stonemasons, and soon related it to the ideals of knighthood, seeing the achievement of equality more as a levelling up than a levelling down, as in England, though wearing of a mason's apron continued as a feature, possibly from an association with a Jacobite Scot living in France, the Chevalier Michael Ramsay. These knightly ideals were embodied in numerous additional related degrees known as Scottish rites, producing a proliferation of ceremonial, but having in fact no clear connection with Scottish Masonry. Some of these degrees, notably the strict observance, which derived from France and was developed in Germany, exceeded acceptable standards and brought Freemasonry into disrepute before they disappeared, but others have, of course, continued respectably and extensively in developed form up to the present day. Despite excesses, the Masonic movement was successful beyond all imagination, and within a very short space of time. In 1738, Frederick Lewis, Prince of Wales, and in 1739, Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia were made Masons. Frederick of Prussia was the future Frederick the Great, who, on his accession as king in 1740, became a protector of the craft. Francis Stephen, Duke of Lorraine, made an English Mason as early as 1730, is said to have introduced Masonic ceremonial into his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 1745. In a later period, shortly before the French Revolution, Masons included among their number both royalist and prospective revolutionaries, and, later still, not only 6 of the sons of George III, but also most of the former non-commissioned officers of the army of Louis XVI, who became marshals of France under Napoleon. More significantly, great men such as Montesquieu, Mozart, Goethe, Franklin, and Washington became members of the craft. Washington wore a Masonic apron at the Masonic ceremony which took place at the laying of the foundation stone of the United States Capitol in the new city of Washington in 1793. All this success was achieved despite strong anti-Masonic opposition from the Church of Rome, commencing in 1738, and to a fluctuating extent from some of the absolutist monarchies of Europe influenced by groundless defamations of Masonry, such as the allegations that Masons had instigated the French Revolution. The formation and development of the English Premier Grand Lodge from 1717 onwards may be seen in retrospect as the most important feature of this period of Masonic history, when, in the late 18th century, particularly in Germany, excesses arose in the attempted development of Masonry and its rituals, including attempts to use them for commercial gain. It was to the pure ideals of English Masonry that a return was sought. Eugene Lenhoff wrote with regard to the reforming work of Frederick Ludwig Schroeder, quote, all those superfluidities which in the course of time had been added to the simple symbolism of English ritual with all its beauty were cast out by Schroeder, close quote. We have seen that in 1742 Perrault, a Frenchman, and the French have rarely been admirers of English culture, presented Masonry largely as it had arrived from England as an ideal system, Again, Lenhoff, when writing of the charges of a Freemason of 1723, referred to them as, quote, a Masonic Magna Carta, the will to avoid anything tending towards disunion, the yearning for a friendly alliance with antagonists, close quote. But English commentators have tended not to appreciate these as great achievements or even to see them as English. This is the next problem of Masonic history to which I wish to refer, namely a failure properly to assess the significance of English Masonry as offered to and accepted by the world from 1720 onwards, a seemingly mental short-sightedness which has failed to grasp the overall historical perspective. The charges of a Freemason of 1723 have largely been unappreciated by the accident of being included in the same volume as the legendary history written in a similar vein to the legendary histories of the old charges, including evident absurdities. Both have been attributed to James Anderson, seen at the same time inconsistently as an innovator of important Masonic ideas and author of history which was not only unreliable but ludicrous, and this belief has persisted despite the fact, as will be shown, the impossibility of such a view as to Anderson was explained by Professor Knoop, Jones and Hamer nearly 50 years ago. The result is the potential value of examining the charges and legendary history to trace earlier tradition has, generally speaking, been ignored. The significance of the charges of 1723 has also been largely unrecognised, I believe, because of the preoccupation of modern Masons with ritual, the charges being seen as a relic largely to be ignored in preference to ritual. But in the 18th century it was the charges, with their simple yet profound virtues of brotherly equality, harmony and charity, which enabled Freemasonry to achieve its lasting success, and to outride persecution by the Church of Rome, caprices of absolutist monarchies and the French Revolution, and which, though emerging into continental Europe and the wider world with the Enlightenment, were to continue as a living force when the Enlightenment had become outmoded. Ritual, generally, was in a varying and unsettled state during that period. To consider a further point, as implication may be drawn that as Anderson was Scottish and the son of a prominent Scottish Mason, the content of the charges of 1723 is probably Scottish, although the charges, which were adopted in the Irish constitutions virtually in the same form in the 1730s, have never been adopted by the Scottish constitutions, even now. Coupled with the fact that as the oldest surviving Masonic catechisms are Scottish and have some resemblance to Masonry dissected, although much shorter, and although the Shaw Statutes and the Mason Word, it would follow that Masonry is, to all intents and purposes, Scottish in origin. The views of David Stevenson are recently familiar to us, but David Murray Lyon, an eminent Scottish Masonic historian of 100 years ago, and protagonist of Scottish Masonry, was ready to allow that when John Theodophilus Desaguliers, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, was welcomed as a brother Mason at the Lodge of Edinburgh in 1721, it was likely that he introduced the Edinburgh Masons to speculative Masonry, Scottish Masonry still being largely operative. Appendix 1 contains comment on the view of Knoop and Jones that English speculative Masonry derived its modes of recognition from the Scottish Mason Word. Appendix 2 also is in part relevant to the problem of trying to understand as far as possible the relative contribution of English and Scottish Masonry to Masonic origins. Next, prior to consider problems as to English ritual in the period between 1720 and 1813, I resume for a moment my historical summary. Having set off colonial and European Masonry on their various ways, English Masonry did not stand still, but the Premier Grand Lodge, founded in 1717, had lost momentum, and by the 1740s had left the way open for a new lodge to be founded in London in 1751, which seems to have catered particularly for would-be Masons who felt themselves excluded by the lodges formed under the Premier Grand Lodge. These included Irishmen living in England, Jews, men serving in the army and navy, and generally men from a more humble background. Irish influence was strong at the outset and continued through a capable Irish Grand Secretary, Lawrence Dermot, who had first become a Mason and a fine ritualist in Ireland, and who organised the new Grand Lodge very successfully, including recognising the value, as with the Premier Grand Lodge, of elevating the status of the institution by having peers as Grand Masters. It is with regard to the antiquity of Masonry especially that Dermot was able to score over the earlier Grand Lodge.
This podcast is for educational purposes and perhaps entertainment. While the Masonic Authors Guild International provides the most accurate information possible, listeners use the information at their own risk. This podcast and its contents are MAGI's property, as are all the opinions and the information it presents. Robert L.D. Cooper's, Mark A. Tabert's, and any other speakers' views and opinions within the podcast do not represent nor speak for Freemasonry, any Masonic organization, their former or current employers, in any way, shape, or form. MAGI, Cooper, or Tabert will not compensate you in any way whatsoever if you ever happen to suffer any inconvenience due to the information herein contained.